Turns out, the coping power script. Picture this, it's 2015, and a team of researchers is running an after-school program teaching middle schoolers how to handle anger and stress. They're not trying to prevent suicide. That's not even on the agenda. They're just teaching kids better coping skills, better emotional control, basic stuff. Flash forward to the data analysis, and something unexpected shows up in the numbers. The kids who went through this program, kids who were struggling with aggression, with emotional dysregulation, with the kind of behavioral problems that get you sent to the principal's office, they show fewer signs of suicidal thoughts than the kids who didn't get the intervention. The program never mentioned suicide once. So what changed? And could it mean that preventing suicide isn't actually about directly targeting suicide at all? Here's the thing about mental health research. We've traditionally operated on a pretty straightforward assumption. If you want to prevent something, you target it. You want to reduce depression? Focus on depression. You want to reduce suicide? Focus on suicide risk. But over the past decade, something interesting has been nagging at researchers. What if life-saving interventions don't work because they focus on the problem itself, but because they fix something upstream? What if they're like repairing a leak in the roof before water damage ruins the entire house? Except the leak is anger management, and the water damage is suicidal ideation. This study, published in May of 2026 in Preventive Science, pulled together 11 different trials involving over 3,000 kids to ask, when a program designed to help with behavioral problems ends up protecting kids from suicidal thoughts, how is that actually happening? This work came from a massive, multi-institutional collaboration. The lead researcher is Morgan-López at RTI International, working alongside Stephen West from Arizona State University and an entire network of researchers from institutions across the country, the University of Alabama, University of Virginia, Johns Hopkins. This isn't someone's pet project. This is a coordinated, carefully designed integrative data analysis that took years to compile. They published it in Preventive Science, which is exactly where this kind of work belongs. It's the field's main journal for research on stopping problems before they start. When a study has this many researchers, this many institutions, and this much data, it means the scientific community has decided the question is important enough to throw real resources at it. Let's talk about what they actually did. The Coping Power Intervention is a real program. It's been around since the 1990s. Basically, it teaches kids coping skills, anger management, how to handle peer pressure, how to problem solve instead of react, how to think about consequences. The research team took data from 11 separate trials where kids, we're talking middle schoolers, ages 10 to 14, were randomly assigned either to get coping power or to a control group that got whatever their school normally offers. Some kids got it in groups, some got it one-on-one. Some versions added mindfulness training, some were delivered online, over 3,000 kids total. Then they measured everything, both parent reports and teacher reports, of whether kids were showing signs of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. They also measured what we call internalizing problems, that's depression, anxiety, emotional withdrawal, and externalizing problems, aggression, rule-breaking, disruptive behavior. Here's the key. They didn't just ask, did suicidal thoughts go down? They asked, if suicidal thoughts went down, which path did they take to get there? Think of it like tracking a package. You can see it left the warehouse, but you need to know the actual route it took through the delivery network. What did they find? Pretty striking stuff. Across every single version of Coping Power, the standard group version, the individual version, the mindfulness version, the online version, they found the same pattern. Kids who received the intervention showed fewer signs of suicidal thoughts and behaviors than the control group, according to both parents and teachers. And here's where it gets interesting. The effect wasn't enormous. This isn't a magic cure. But the consistency across different program formats, across different ways of delivering it, across 3,000 kids. That consistency matters. It tells you something real is happening. Now the question was, how? How does a program that never mentions suicide somehow protect kids from suicidal thoughts? The answer? By reducing behavioral and emotional problems first. Kids who went through coping power showed improvements in aggression, in emotional dysregulation, in depression and anxiety. And those improvements then predicted lower levels of suicidal thoughts. It's like the program didn't shoot straight at the target. It shot at the target's foundation, and the whole thing became more stable. Here's what this means in practical terms. Right now, suicide prevention in schools mostly focuses on training teachers to recognize warning signs, or on direct screening for suicidal ideation. Those things have value. But this research suggests something quieter might be equally important. Making sure kids can handle emotions without exploding, teaching them problem-solving skills, helping them manage conflict. You don't need to scare kids by talking about suicide. You just need to make them less reactive, less desperate, less emotionally volatile. That's a huge shift in strategy. It's also optimistic because it means you can implement these programs in schools without creating awkward conversations or potentially traumatizing kids who aren't at risk. You just run an after-school program on anger management, and it turns out you've also protected kids from suicidal thoughts. Now, we should be honest about limitations. Teacher and parent reports of suicidal thoughts aren't the same as clinical assessments. Kids might hide things from adults. The effect sizes are moderate, not massive. And correlation isn't causation. Even though this is structured to suggest causal pathways, you can't be 100% certain about mechanisms just from data. The kids who completed these programs might be different from kids who didn't in ways the researchers couldn't control for. Still, when you see the same pattern hold up across 11 different studies, that consistency is compelling. This fits into a bigger conversation that's happening in prevention science right now about what researchers call transdiagnostic or transtheoretical approaches. Instead of building separate programs for depression and separate programs for anxiety and separate programs for behavioral problems, what if you built one program that targeted the underlying mechanisms that feed all of these things? Like, what if aggression, emotional dysregulation, and depression all share common roots? Poor coping skills, inability to handle frustration, negative thinking patterns? Then a program that addresses those common roots would improve all of them at once. That's what coping power seems to be doing. It's like identifying that 3 different diseases in a hospital all have the same underlying infection. So instead of 3 separate treatments, you give one antibiotic that fixes the root problem. The next frontier for this research is actually following kids longer. This study looked at relatively short-term outcomes. What happens 5 years later? 10 years later? Do these reductions in suicidal thoughts actually translate into fewer suicide attempts? Do they prevent completed suicides? That's the question that matters most, and it's also the hardest one to answer because thankfully suicide attempts are rare enough that you need enormous sample sizes to detect differences. There's also the question of why different formats of coping power, group, individual, mindfulness, online, all seem to work. Are they actually working through the same mechanisms, or are there different pathways for different kids? Understanding that could help match kids to the best intervention for them. Turns out, preventing suicide might not require us to talk about suicide at all. Teaching a kid how to calm down when they're angry, how to think through problems instead of just reacting, how to sit with uncomfortable emotions without exploding, that apparently can save their life. The evidence from 3,000 kids across 11 different studies suggests that the path to suicidal thoughts isn't inevitable, and you don't reach it by being depressed or anxious alone. You reach it through a combination of emotional dysregulation and distress, a kind of perfect storm of not being able to cope and feeling terrible simultaneously. But interrupt one part of that equation, teach someone to cope better, and the whole system gets more stable. Turns out, scientists have been busy, and they're not done yet.